And it's BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the program. My guest on the show today is Ray Grant, author of Zodiac Killer Solved, as well as the novel Zodiac Killer Dreams. And Ray Grant has a very different type of Zodiac Killer theory, but he has been following this case for decades, as well as a host of other true crime cases, and he has a lot to share with us. Ray, how you doing?
What's up, Ned? I'm glad we're finally meeting. We had our connection was a little bit problematical because Ned had to walk me through the connection on Skype. I've never used it before, but I'm glad we finally made it together.
Yes, and Ray and I have had a lot of interactions via like email or especially in the comments section on YouTube. However, this is the first time that we've had the opportunity to speak and discuss some of these true crime cases and stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I told you like before you hit record there. It's like we used to be reasonably close because I'm in Pittsburgh and Ned was in the eastern section of West Virginia, so we're maybe like 3 hours apart. But now you're on the other end of the world, basically.
That's right, coming to you from the Philippines.
Is it hot where you are now?
Absolutely, every day. There's only one season, summer, 12 months a year.
And it's like what? So it's like maybe 9:15 there. Let me take a look. 9:19.
9:19, that's right, 9:19 p.m., but the 12-hour
What's
difference
the
is so
temperature?
helpful. Temperature? Something hot and with a whole lot of humidity. That's up there, but I like chilling inside. Got the fans blowing. Hope that doesn't pick up though. But
I can't hear anything. But what's funny is we just had our Halloween. I sent you pictures of what our Halloween looks like, where I give out the big bars and everything out in the front of our house. And normally this time of year in Pittsburgh, the weather's maybe I don't know, maybe like 60. If it's a colder Halloween, it might be like in the mid 50s or so. But this year was like 40, and it was like none of the people brought their like little kids out, but none of the usual teenagers and college kids came out. I guess because or very few of them came out. So we were sitting out in front of the house, and I live in a side by side duplex. So my neighbors had one of those circular things where you put like tree branches in and you set them on fire.
oh
And
yeah,
it's amazing how warm they get. I mean, you can actually warm up like a group of people like around the container. And but it was like 2 hours of basically being cold. And so it's I'm kind of having like the opposite experience of what you're going through right now.
did you get snow in Pittsburgh?
Not yet. It's the thing in I went to parochial school, so it's like every year we got sent up here in Pittsburgh. We got sent to once a year. All the kids went up to the seminary, which is I think it's in Northeast PA, which ironically is actually in the northwest part of the state, and but it's relatively near Erie. It's I think it was St. Mary's Seminary, and so you go up there if you go to parochial school. At least back in the '60s, you went up there once a year, and you can literally like if you're going up there, let's say right around this time of the year. You leave Pittsburgh and it's nice and dry, and when you hit the snow line or what have you, all of a sudden there's snow everywhere. So by the time you get up to Erie and the lake effect snow and everything like that, it's like you're in the middle of winter, and you were like maybe in late fall when you left Pittsburgh. So it's but we haven't I think we've come close to having snow, but we haven't actually had any yet. However, the leaves are like all over our backyard right now.
Yes, and I have to give a shout out to Andrew WVA, who sent me a photo of West Virginia because, I'm missing the place. And he sent me a photo of the snow that they had on Halloween, I believe, somewhere in the northern part of the state, not as far north of Pittsburgh, of course, but yeah, so it's kind of a crazy world.
I was going to ask you when you left West Virginia, did you say goodbye?
No, I didn't, because no one would get that except people who are following Zodiac
Yeah,
Monday and
Zodiac. That's
Zodiac
like
Killer News Report.
Tom Voight sells those. I think I have my around the corner here somewhere. I have my the Zodiac mask. Instead of wearing just like a regular face mask, you can get one that has like the Zodiac characters.
I
The
remember having
problem with that is nobody that you actually run into in normal life is going to have any idea what the symbols mean, you know?
yeah.
So basically it's like if people stop you, they say, "What the heck do you have on your face there?" And you
I
say, "Oh,
remember
it's
the same. Oh
I
yeah.
follow, I'm one of those weirdos who follows the Zodiac Killer online, and they sell these, believe it or not." So, can you
Okay,
imagine people selling merchandise online? By the way, I mean
about the Zodiac.
huh?
About the Zodiac killer, you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I was really quite surprised because they don't seem to be people who are following the case. Like you'll just see random T-shirt websites that have a Zodiac killer T-shirt with like the Lake Berryessa hood holding a gun or something, and I was like, I don't feel right purchasing that because like from some just Joe Schmo vendor or something like that. I don't. He was a
Well,
murderer.
I have a Z340 T-shirt, and those are actually pretty cool because I hate to say this, it's an interesting design to have on the shirt.
Oh,
You have like all those symbols, and it's also mysterious because people have no idea what it is. But I've what people don't realize, I think maybe people your age, because you actually were born after I started following and investigating the Zodiac killers, circa 1985. So it's before you were born.
yeah.
And what people don't realize is this cannot be emphasized enough. Okay, the Zodiac killer amount of publicity that you're used to now didn't exist years ago. It used to be very much of a niche case. And literally, you would have, if you mentioned the Zodiac killer, you would have to explain to people who he was, where he operated, and so forth. And one of the uh, things that was a result of that is I used to be able to call the original investigators in the case. I
Wow.
think I mentioned a few days ago on, or maybe a couple weeks ago on Tom's board. In 1991, I had several long conversations with Detective George Baywart and now Captain Roy well, not anymore. This was in 91. Captain Roy Conway of Vallejo PD. And we were going back. I mean, I would call them one night and we'd talk about the Zodiac killer for an hour or two. And then the next night, my phone would ring and it'd be Captain Roy Conway, and we'd go on. And I sent them copies of my book. And so it used to be you had all kinds of access to the investigators and to the police departments. And now, particularly with the David Fincher movie, the case is turned into a Jack the Ripper, and everybody's familiar with it, and they have the Ted Cruz joke and everything else. And you can't communicate. It's like people like Mike Morford have complained about the fact you can't get a response from departments like Riverside PD and SFPD. Forget about it. You might as well, if you write them a letter or an email or what have you, you might as well just like flush it down the toilet because the case has just gotten so much PR now, and they get so many nuts, following it, like myself, for example. But like I said, years ago, I had no trouble whatsoever talking to people like Fred Shirosego was head of the California Department of Justice investigation of the Zodiac killer. He was the official head of the investigation. Who else did I talk to? Talked to Daryl Bressler, who is the head of because I believe if you read Time 17, Gareth Penn mentions that he believed that Michael O'Hare caused the Atlas Peak fire in Napa in California back in 1981. So I had several long conversations with Daryl Bressler, who was a investigator for the state of California back then. Again, we're talking about more than 30 years ago. I had a long phone conversation with Melvin Belli about the case. Okay. So,
Wow.
yeah. So, well, here's the thing. That sounds fantastic, right? And people say, oh, what did you and Melvin Belli talk about? And here's the problem. If you talk to Melvin Belli, you don't say anything. He talks the entire time. It's like you say, hi, Melvin, and then you could put the foot down and go take a shower, put the phone down, go take a shower, what have you, come back, he'd still be talking. I mean, he literally never shut up. And so, I mean, he just like talked into my ear for 10 minutes about like what his take on the Zodiac killer was. And I couldn't really ask him any questions. So, and he was a busy man too. That was the other part of it. So, you know, but like I said, the access you had years ago was fantastic. And as a result of so many people contacting police agencies in the wake of the Fincher movie, you just don't have that anymore. So, I mean, you know that when somebody like Mike Morford is throwing his hands up, even the idea of like contacting Riverside PD and asking them something, you know that that it's like a real problem.
Like they've been overwhelmed with tips and suggestions and people
I gotta
saying, "My
make like
dad used
10
the
names,
Zodiac."
by the way, right now, and take a sip of water.
Sure, sure. Well, first, hopefully later in the episode, we can get into some things about what Melvin Belli had to say about the Zodiac. But to start, I would really like you to talk about your observations about the case and your Zodiac theory, because you definitely look at the case in a way that is different than almost any other person that I've encountered. I mean, some people have some similar takes on the subject, but your Zodiac theory and observations are pretty unique. Would you even agree to that?
Well, here's the thing. When I wrote a book called The Zodiac Murders Solved in 1990, and it eventually showed up online because people started again, this is long before there was an internet. And when when there were Zodiac websites put up, people who had run across a copy of my 1990 book started posting pages of it onto message boards. And as a result of that, I didn't even post on the internet for the first time I did it, I think was like June of 2010. And even then it was on Mike Morford's private board. So it wasn't exactly out on the internet. Although I think you can now go to that board and people can go to the board and read it. But I had never actually, I just thought, well, what I think about the case is so different from what everybody else thinks about it that there's like no point in my engaging. If I had it to do over again, I would probably have posted on Tom Voigt's original archive board because I think that was probably the most impressive collection of people. You had people like not just Tom, but you had Mike Rodelli, you had Mike Butterfield, you had Scott Bullock, you had Jake Warwick, who that's a name I'm assuming you're familiar with.
No, actually, who's that?
Oh, Jake Warwick was like a big name with originally when the internet first. And you can actually, if you Google Jake, it'll take you to his crime library article on the Zodiac killer, and I think he wrote several articles about the various crimes. But he was a big name back around whenever 1999, 2000, what have you. And he was eventually did press releases for the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office in Greater Boston. So that was like, it was kind of a star-studded group of people on the original archive message board. I don't think that's been matched since in terms of people's, we know more about the case now than we did, 20 years ago. But in terms of like expertise, there was probably more of that on that board than you've seen anywhere since. So, but I just I just felt I was so different from everybody else that I didn't want to get into arguing with people. If I had it to do over again, I would probably have posted on that board, and just in that way, I think there wouldn't be as I wouldn't have gotten like the shocked reaction that I got from other people. But the problem that I see with Zodiac Killer forums now is And frankly, I would say it about, your just concluded video with McAdam, which is that, it's all well and good to talk about the psychology of a serial killer. I told you I'm eventually going to come out with a book, maybe later this year or later, sometime next year about Ted Bundy.
Yeah.
And almost everything that, even though I have a psych background, almost anything I say about Bundy is going to be speculation because I never personally had like any kind of a clinical interaction with him. So what you're doing is you're guessing, what's causing like various issues with the person involved. Okay, but so we all do it to an extent, but still, I don't see necessarily the value of, particularly on Reddit, but you also see it on Tom's board, of people talking about the psychology of somebody when you're not first talking about what happened in the crimes. If I'm watching TV and I tune into Forensic Files, or I tune into Dateline NBC, or some true crime show, and Discovery ID, and at some point, if you're watching a show like that, like whenever 5 minutes, you expect the initial part of the show where the people are going to say, oh, this housewife had everything to live for, and one day she went out and she went out into the woods and she was gone forever and she never came back. I expect some kind of like lead in, sensationalism, at the beginning of the show, but at some point they're going to talk about the specific facts of the case. And one of the things I pointed out recently on Tom's board was there is absolutely no case theory anywhere to be seen on the Zodiac Killer message boards. Nobody does what a prosecutor would do in a court of law, which is to say, okay, we believe that this person was here and then he got a gun and he wanted to kill. They basically walk you through the crime from the vantage point of the killer. And that's the whole idea behind a prosecution. You don't just show up in the courtroom and throw whatever forensics you have and whatever basic facts you have down on a table and say, here, judge, okay, here's our case. You have to have some sort of story, a scenario that walks you through it. And you just don't see that on the Zodiac Killer message boards. And part of the problem that we have is that you have, I'm going to make Ned very upset when I say this, okay, but I have to say it, which is being weird is a crime. What do I mean by that? Here's what I mean.
Yes, please. I need to
Now,
hear this
generally speaking, being weird is not a crime, but anytime that you are investigating a murder and something weird happens, something out of the normal normal events occurs, then you have to ask yourself, wouldn't this be involved with the murder? In other words, if something weird happened, and lots of weird things happened with the Sherry Bates murder, lots of really weird things happened on Lake Herman Road that night that the two teenagers were killed. How come they're not talking about any of that, on the Zodiac Killer message boards? They're just saying, oh, this a white Chevy Impala pulled into the turnout. It was in there for maybe like a half hour or so. Frank Gasser comes out through gate number 10. He shines his flashlight into this parked car with nobody inside it. It's just sitting there out in the middle of nowhere on a pitch dark road in a turnout. And what Frank Gasser said was he was wondering what this car was doing out there. Shouldn't we be wondering what that car was doing out there, especially when we know that two teenagers were killed in that spot? But it's almost as if, people on Zodiac Killer message boards are saying, oh yeah, I mean, weird stuff like that happens all the time. Sherry Bates was never seen in the RCC library the night she was killed by anyone. Riverside PD did a reconstruction of the night where they walked everybody through what they did, had them wear the same clothes and go through the same motions. Nobody saw her. Doesn't that seem weird? Doesn't it seem weird that Sherry Bates was presumably, if you go by the confession letter, out in front of the RCC library for an hour and a half before she was murdered, trying to start her car? You know, Ted Bundy was interviewed by Stephen Michaud when he was initially in prison, and he mentioned the fact that he learned early on not to disable women's cars. And the reason for that is if you disable a girl's car, what ends up happening is all these males come out of the woodwork and try to, help the damsel in distress. So you're kind of defeating the whole process of you're trying to get her alone, because as soon as people see that guys see that she's trying to start her car, they're going to run over there and try to help her. And yet we are expected to believe that somehow Sherry Bates was in front of the library for an hour and a half and nobody noticed. Okay, so it's you reach a point where you start to say, I don't think I'm ever going to get people to look closely at the evidence in the case because they haven't done it up till now. Why would they start? And the thing that you have to remember is when I wrote my initial book in 1990, I didn't talk about any of that stuff. I talked about the conceptual art angle of the case. And it wasn't until I had on Tom Voigt's website, I had access to the police reports. And I remember going through there used to be a poster named Sean O'Brien, who went by Sean, and I was on the message board with him over a period of maybe a month or so, and we were talking about the various witness statements on Lake Herman Road. And I suddenly realized, hey, you can actually set up a timeline of when things happened and what happened. If you just follow by this guy was here at this time and he saw this and so forth, you can actually construct a scenario of what happened on the road that night. It's a little bit like I'm sure you're familiar with the John F. Kennedy assassination. One of the great things about the Zapruder film is that the Zapruder film puts a stopwatch on everything that happened from the time about 11 seconds prior to the murder of JFK, until after the headshot. And so we know exactly when things happen. We know exactly when the second shot hit and so forth. And to an extent, we can do that on Lake Herman Road. So that was the idea. You would think that more people would be interested in that, but they aren't for whatever reason.
But Ray, so many things to respond to in that. There's so many things to respond to in that, because if we first look at Sherry Jo Bates, who was murdered on October 30th of 1966 in Riverside, California, a possible Zodiac crime. In the minds of many, she's a confirmed victim, but in the minds of some, she is not. Even I have my own doubts.
Probably about 50-50.
Yes, absolutely. But there is the skeptical response to everything that you just said, that Sherry Jo Bates eventually made it to the library, and maybe she just went to the back, found a table or something far off corner, and is doing her studying, and is just kind of like real focused on something. And then she left at the time that a lot of people believe that she left, and found her car disabled, and maybe a little bit of walking up and down. And I mean, you've heard all this stuff before, so like, why is that skeptical response wrong?
Well, I would say the main reason that it's wrong is that Sherry Bates was very high on everybody's radar screen. If you look at the 2.5 hours prior to she is last seen at 6:15 p.m. She calls Stephanie Gutman at 3:45 p.m. So we have 7 incidents in the 2.5 hours prior to whenever she would have gotten to the library, where she is noticed or otherwise contacted by people, or she contacts somebody. 6:45 or 3:45 p.m. she calls Stephanie Gutman. At 4:30 p.m., a friend of hers goes by her house, notices that her car is parked in front of her house. At circa 5:20 p.m., her dad, having come back to the house, sees that Sherry has left a note for him. Dad went to RCC library. At around 5:30 p.m., I don't want to characterize the ethnicity of the student. Another student sees Sherry Bates sitting in front of the quad building, writing in her notepad. At right around 5:30 p.m., probably a little bit after that, her friend Donna gets a call from Sherry asking if she knows where her bibliography is. At 6:10 p.m., a friend of Sherry sees her driving on Magnolia Avenue, heading in the direction of RCC, right around the area of where the Magnolia Center is. And at 6:15 p.m., a March Air Force Base man who is in the back of his apartment house, probably I assume the Shelley Lynn Apartments, which were at 4710 Magnolia Avenue, sees a blonde in a green VW Beetle driving up the alley behind his building, and it was closely followed by another car. So you have 7 instances just in the 2.5 hours prior to Sherry Jo Bates going to the library, where she was either seen or was otherwise contacted by other people. And keep in mind, during those 7 instances, she was alone. She was either in her house or she was sitting outside the quad building by herself, or she was driving in her car. Okay, now you have her inside a 35 by 70 library with a room 35 feet by 70 feet, where there were friends of hers there. And Sherry Bates that morning had teased the lady in Sandy's restaurant because they hadn't served her French toast yet. And Sherry Bates, her father says, had basically teased her unmercifully about that. So is Sherry Bates going to keep quiet for 3 hours inside the library? Are the friends of hers who were in there going to keep quiet? And are other people at least going to notice this very attractive blonde? The 29 fraternity pledges, they wouldn't have noticed her. Okay, it just doesn't make any sense. And the Riverside PD did the reenactment because they couldn't place Sherry Bates anywhere after 6:15 p.m. that night. Okay, it's just Sherry Bates couldn't have been in the library without somebody noticing, without her saying something to somebody. How did she check out 3 books, according to people, if without the librarian noticing her?
That's
And if
part
she
of
did
that.
it, yeah, if she ran in, checked the books out, ran back out again, wouldn't because there wouldn't have been anybody else in the line, would that librarian have noticed it?
You would think so, but that's again like that big issue that people are still debating about to this day. I mean, because the books are found in the car, but no one sees her in the library. And I mean, I've heard all types of theories about how it's like a male and a female with a female accomplice. Not your theory, but just that
Well,
kind
it's
of
in
like
the
the boyfriend.
newspapers. It's in the newspapers the day after the reenactment. The newspaper, the front page newspaper article leads off with, police are looking for 2 people who were seen inside the library who didn't come back. You can check. I don't know if it was in the Riverside Press or the Riverside Enterprise, but that's what the front page article in the newspaper said. The other thing is, as I said, it isn't just the fact that she wasn't seen inside the library. She wasn't seen trying to start a car for an hour and a half. You have the problem of how she left her car. She did not leave her car in a way, according to her fiance, that she would normally have left it. She left it with the windows down, the doors unlocked, her books and her notepad on the passenger seat of the car, and the key in the ignition. Now, I've been driving for 50 years. Okay, I've been driving since 1973. I don't think in my entire life, I have ever walked away from a car that I owned or a car that I'd rented or what have you, and left the key in the ignition. Okay. I believe that was done involuntarily. I also think it's very difficult. There was a reviewer on Amazon who talked about uh, Sherry Bates's stomach contents, which are mentioned in the preview to my book. And he said, well, Ray Grant doesn't allow for the fact that Sherry Bates may have had some sort of unusual gastrointestinal syndrome that caused her to digest food more slowly than most people. Well, I'm willing to allow for that possibility, but the problem with it is stomach contents are criminology 101. If you watch CSI or any of the NCIS or any of the crime shows where they're walking around with people and they have the medical examiners have like the stomach contents inside like a Ziploc bag and they're talking about the victim ate a large meal just before he was killed or what it's basic criminology. Okay. So if you're looking at all of those things, they just it does not make sense that Sherry Bates was moving around under her own power. Later that night after 6:15 p.m. Nobody sees her. There's no contact with her whatsoever. You have the problem of her stomach. She has too much food in her stomach. She leaves her car in a way that her fiance says she would never have left it. So basically, you have all of that, going against that. Here's the thing. There's a movie that was made in Pittsburgh, I think in 2012, with Tom Cruise. It was called Jack Reacher. You may be familiar if you do a lot of reading. So you probably read one of the Jack Reacher novels. One of the things that the Tom Cruise character says in that movie is he says, I'm willing to go with one weird detail. I'm not willing to go like with a half dozen weird details. If there are a half dozen things that are completely weird, that don't make any sense, then something's wrong. And you see that also in Lake Herman Road. Why would David Faraday spend so much time at the behest of Melody Jobe, Betty Lou's older sister, that he ingratiate the parents, take Betty Lou out, just to make, just so that they accept the two as a couple, and then stay out on Lake Herman Road after 11 o'clock, which was their curfew. Why would he still have the ring that he was going to give Betty Lou in his hands after he died? If he had spent whatever, an hour, 2 hours necking with her in the car, wouldn't he have stopped at some point, come up for air, and said, oh, by the way, here's the ring I was going to give you? No, he still had the ring. Betty Lou Jensen's bladder was full. The car's engine was lukewarm. Okay, it should have been red hot if they were spending that much time presumably with the heater on. If the heater wasn't on, the windows should have been fogged up, and they weren't. Okay, so I don't know how many weird things have to happen before people start to say, well, maybe something strange happened here. But far if you're talking about like the average poster on Zodiac Killer message boards, I'm losing the argument. So,
Well, let's go back to first with Riverside, then to Lake Herman Road.
You want to do the Cherry Bates walkthrough?
Well, I want to know who are your suspects, who committed the murder, and talk about the motivation. You did touch upon it in the past when you mentioned the conceptual art. And right. Just in case someone is not familiar with who your suspects are, why don't you introduce that now?
Well, again, I started on the Zodiac Killer case because there was an article in the July-August edition of the Mensa Bulletin. I was a member of Mensa from 1984 to 1988. There are a lot of people who have been very sarcastic about the fact that I'm supposedly a Mensa member. I haven't belonged to Mensa since you were born, actually, since
88, that's me.
1988. So it's been more than 35 years now. I left Mensa in 88, but in the 4 years that I was a member, Gareth Penn wrote an article which appeared in the July-August Mensa Bulletin. It was called The Calculus of Evil. And it was the presentation of this idea that although Michael O'Hare wasn't mentioned in the article, but you can go online and you can Google The Calculus of Evil Gareth Penn, and it will show you that article. But it's basically the idea that the Zodiac killer was creating geometric designs on the map and on the face of the planet. So that was the idea. There was contact information for Gareth Penn in the article. I ended up calling Gareth. Gareth and I talked to each other on the phone numerous times for the first year or so. I was actually shocked when I was on Morph's board back in 2010, when I went back and looked at my letters, and the earliest letter that I actually had from Gareth, I believe, was like from August of 86. So apparently for the first year or so, we didn't actually correspond by mail. We just talked on the phone, but we talked quite a bit on the phone. And then we started sending, letters back and forth. This was long before email. And so I got a lot of Gareth's handouts. He would do a presentation, which was done, as I said, before they had email. People would actually do presentations where somebody would write a paper and it would be stapled together and be 9 or 10 pages of whatever, an argument, like a dissertation or what have you, and you would go through it. And Gareth did a lot of those. So that's basically what my background is. If you read, I'm sure you've at least attempted to read Time 17 at some point.
Yeah, I've read, I guess you'd say I've read most of it. I did have to jump ahead a little bit because it gets just.
You never read from beginning to end, right? I mean, you kind of jump. You do the same thing I do, which is I very rarely start on page 1 and read through. I just jump around and see what interests me.
I tried to read that one starting at page 1, but he just, so much of it is just rearranging the numbers and talking about the Morse code and the binary, and I'm like, wait a second, I want to get to the part where he's tying this to Massachusetts and how all of that's going to come together. But yes, to answer your question, yes, I've attempted to read Time 17 by Gareth Penn.
Yeah, well, the thing is, a lot of what I mentioned in the book, by the way, I mentioned on page 40, I mentioned in Robert Graysmith's Zodiac Unmasked on page 421. Roy Conway mentions me. I'm also mentioned in Klaus Schmey's Nicht zu Nacken, but the book's in German, so I don't think anyone wants to order it unless you're fluent in German. But
I'm not, but I'm curious.
What?
I'm not fluent in German, but I'm curious about this book.
Well, unfortunately you can't get it like a I thought, hey, I'll just order it. I'll order an ebook copy and I'll use the Google Translator or something. Yeah. But I don't think it's available in ebook. It might be interesting just to order a copy of the book just to have it. I don't know, but I can't actually. Klaus Schmey was nice enough to send me translated parts of the chapters where I'm mentioned. So I mean that was nice. By the way, I need to give a shout out to Dave Aranchek because he pointed. I didn't even know about that, and he pointed it out to me in one of his articles. So, but as far as Time 17 goes, what you see in Time 17 is very similar to the types of things that Gareth would mail to his correspondents, where there would be, if you can imagine, one of the chapters of that book in maybe a 10-page dissertation or what have you, stapled together and put in a manila envelope, which you should know about. You're in the Philippines now, so manila envelopes, that's where they make them, right?
So I've been told.
So, but anyway, what you see in Time 17 is basically what you get from Gareth Penn. It's the general theory, and then there are like a lot of places where he talks about the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans and Dante's Inferno and so forth. So that was my original interest in the case, was in the conceptual art idea. And by the way, this whole idea of conceptual art being some kind of a weird thing that nobody knows about. There was the artist named Christo did a thing in Central Park in New York City in 2005. It was called the Gates in Central Park, and you can Google that, and it will explain what the art project was. And it went on for 26. The project itself went on for 26 years, and the project involves the artists like getting permits and doing construction and so forth. And it's like nobody ever wants to do anything publicly. If you wanted to put up a sculpture in your local city center square, you would have to get the permission of the city fathers and so forth, and you would have to go through a permit process. We just had the city of Pittsburgh just ticketed myself and my neighbor at the beginning of the summer because our sidewalk was not up to standards. There were like some cracks in our front sidewalk, and I found out that in Pittsburgh you were responsible for the sidewalk in front of your house. Okay, so the city ticketed us, and then we had to get a permit to have or I did, to have like the front sidewalk like rebuilt, and they had to take a tree out. We had to contact forestry, the city forestry department, and they came, and there was this beautiful tree in front of our if you look at the pictures I sent you about Halloween last year, the tree is actually still there. But now that tree is gone, unfortunately, because they had to cut it down because they said the tree had a hole in it, and they said, well, if we prune the roots, the tree's going to fall over. And I'm making all of this comment to point out that anytime you do anything that has to do with a city government or a county government or what have you, there's like a permit process, and I'm supposed to be reimbursed by the city for part of the cost of putting a new sidewalk in because they took the tree out. And when I contacted them, they said, okay, but you have to file for a permit to, we have to take a look at the permit process, see what you were allowed to do, see what we're required to reimburse you for, and so forth. So if you're doing any kind of thing that has to do with art, in conceptual art, or you're putting up a statue or what have you have to go through that process with the local government. Okay, so Christo started the Gates in Central Park in 1979. It didn't come to fruition until 2005 in February. So all of these things that I'm talking about, it may sound like something from outer space to some people, but it's something that goes on all the time. And when he did the gates in Central Park, there's something like 10,000 of these metal gates that had this cloth coming down that was saffron, and they were set up in Central Park, and the entire thing was only up for 2 weeks. Okay, so they spent 26 years setting up something that lasted for 2 weeks, basically, and then they took it down and everything got warehoused. So if you're talking to people, I've had this discussion with people who are professors of fine art at colleges, at Carnegie Mellon, for example, and they're I mentioned the Zodiac killer, and it's like, oh yeah, I mean that idea makes perfect sense. Well, I mean it's a bizarre application of something that is relatively common. There's you can Google, those of you who are watching right now, get your phones and Google this artist by the name of Chris Burden, ChrisBurden. And Chris Burden set up back in the early 1970s, set himself up to, one of his presentations was to have himself shot by a 22 rifle. Okay. And it's an entire like video experience where you see him and a friend of his shoots him in the arm, and they show you the before and after, and you know, the whole thing's like this little movie. And he also had himself crucified to the back of a VW Beetle, where he's coming out of a garage and he is nailed to the back of a Volkswagen. Okay. And when I was talking online one day on I think it was on Tom Voigt's board, and this guy who's like more familiar with this stuff than I am said, this is referred to in the art world as the dark avant-garde. Okay, it's the really weird stuff that people engage in, and some artists have engaged in. And in the case of the Zodiac killers, it was just they took that idea and just gave it like a real hard shove and said, let's create the serial killer called the Zodiac killer and have him go about, and we will set up the overall design of the project was they had a point in Riverside, they had an angle in the San Francisco Bay Area. They intended to create a triangle in the greater Boston area. They also have, if you read Time 17, and not just in Garrett's book, but for example, there's a book called This is the Zodiac Speaking by Mike Kelleher, where he mentions that the Timex watch that was found by Sherry Bates's body was stopped at 12:22. And that's what Garrett says. So if you look at where Donna Lass was abducted, which was actually in State Line, Nevada, but it's the border goes through, on one side of the border, it's State Line, Nevada. The other side of the border, it's South Lake Tahoe, California. Okay. But it's the same area. It's like if you're on this street, you're in one state. If you walk across the street, you're in a different state. If you look at the border between Nevada and California and you apply it to a clock face, the border reads 12:22. Now, there are two problems with that. First of all, the California-Nevada border would, in that instance, would be the hour hand would be directly vertical. Whereas if it were actually 12:22 on a clock, the hour hand would be 11 degrees to the right of straight up. And also, the angle of the California-Nevada border is actually 131 degrees, which would translate to 12:21:50, not 12:22. But if you allow for those two quibbles, the border between California and Nevada, which is symbolized by the abduction of Donna Lass, may be said to read 12:22. It's a clock face. Okay. So that's the general idea was to create a design on the map of the United States. And with a pointed riverside, an angle and a radiant angle at the San Francisco Bay Area, and a triangle in greater Boston. That's the idea. And most of what I wrote about in my book in 1990 and up until I was posting online was about that. And then, as I just told you, I became interested in the specific crimes and how they were committed. And that's when I started setting up like case theory and what, as you know, since you've read my book consists of 21 chapters. The first 12 chapters are just about the evidence. They don't even touch on any of the conceptual art stuff. So
yes, but you mentioned that they wanted to create this conceptual art design, and you've talked about two of your suspects, Michael O'Hare and Gareth Penn, Who are the other two suspects in your theory?
Michael O'Hare and Gareth Penn are the two living suspects. Gareth Penn was born January 1st, 1941. So he will turn in another couple of months, I guess, he will turn 83. And Michael O'Hare was born January 22nd, 1943. So again, in another 2.5 months, he will turn, what is that, 81. So, and I'm 72. So, I mean, it's a matter, I'm 72 and a half, actually. So it's a matter of which of us goes first. And there's no guarantee that either of these remaining two zodiacs, there were four originally, there's no guarantee that that they'll leave anything behind. They may just say, you know what, people didn't figure this out. That's their problem. We'll just let it be Jack the Ripper the rest of the time, and not leave behind any information or what have you. Or they may do the opposite of that and leave lots of information and leave. Michael O'Hare may have a safety deposit box in the bank somewhere that has Paul Stein's wallet and his car keys. And also, what people never mention is I had an official for the yellow cab in San Francisco mentioned to me. He said, if you're a cab driver in San Francisco, you carry a badge. There is literally a taxi driver's badge, which was not found with Paul Stein after he was shot. So if that were put in a safety deposit box, that would be with the wallet and the key. So that's a possibility. The other two people were Berta Margulies, who was born September 7th, 1907 in Poland. She died in Walnut Creek, California, I want to say March 18th, 1996. UPenn was Berta Margulies was the first sculptor, first secretary for the Sculptors Guild in New York in 1937. She was a very active artist. I find her artwork very pleasing to look at. I thought she was like a really great artist, although she was more of a conventional artist. She wasn't a member of the avant-garde, but she was considered a member of the New York group. So she would have been in with people like Robert Motherwell. And if you want to consider Jackson Pollock in with that group, I mean, she was part of the forefront of the New York art scene in the 1950s. So, and UPenn was a statistician for the California Highway Patrol, and also eventually for the California Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office. He was born October. When was you born? October 19th, I think. Yeah, October 19th, 1913. You died, was the first of the Zodiacs to die. He died in June, not sure the date, maybe June 20th, June 18th of 1995. So two of these Zodiacs are now dead, but Gareth and Michael are still alive and probably watching this. They're probably watching Ray Grant and Ned Dehan right now
Are
on
you
this video.
sure? Because as you know, I once contacted Michael O'Hare to give his
Right.
statements, and he absolutely denied any knowledge of this Ray Grant that you speak of. And I've not had the opportunity to discuss this with Gareth Penn, but I would love to, except for the fact that he is retired. I was going to save all that stuff for contacting Michael O'Hare for later on in the episode, but
I'm
by
going
the
to switch to my hot chocolate now, and I've been drinking water, but I need some energy now.
hot chocolate is amazing. Now, Ray, I think one of the biggest things about your theory is that not
Well, let
only.
me answer your question first.
Oh yes, go ahead.
I don't know if you noticed. Well, actually, I do know that you've noticed this because you told me. Michael O'Hare pretends not to know who I am, and yet I showed you. If you can go to the web archive of Mike Butterfield's crackpot files, And Butterfield mentions the fact that Michael O'Hare brought me up in a telephone conversation in 1999, okay, out of the blue, because Butterfield didn't know who I was. So now he didn't name me, but he was talking about people who had written books about him being the Zodiac killer. So how many of those are there? Let's see. There's Gareth Penn and there's Ray Grant, okay? And he also mentioned the fact that that the guy lived in Pennsylvania. Okay, so I assume that he was talking about me. And then apparently, Michael O'Hare realized his error in saying this to Butterfield, and he contacted Butterfield and he said, you know, I think you better take that paragraph out of your crackpot files. So Butterfield then edits the 3 sentences out of the crackpot files. The mistake that Butterfield made, you know, Butterfield has that thing where I had once claimed that I had, and it's a kind of ridiculous thing. I made a semantic claim to have invented the term Zodiac killer, and it was based on the idea that if you read Graysmith's book, he invariably refers to the killer as Zodiac.
Sure.
He doesn't call him the Zodiac killer, although when he does mention the Zodiac killer, it's Zodiac with a capital Z, but killer, the K lowercase. Okay, and what I was trying to claim, and this was basically a joke. It was something I brought up on a message board on Tom Voigt's message board, and I said, hey, I think I may have been the first person to actually use the term Zodiac, capital Z, and killer, capital K-I-L-L-E-R, because if you read newspaper accounts of people like the Son of Sam, you will see that a lot of times they will say the Son of Sam killer, okay? And killer, the K like lowercase, they just put the term killer after whoever it is. If it's Seattle Ted, who is Ted Bundy, the Seattle Ted killer, okay? So the point I was trying to make, it didn't make much of an impression on people, was that particular semantic term I had used before anybody else did.
Do you stand by that?
In a family, what?
Do you stand by that?
Mike Butterfield was right about that. I just hadn't. I should probably have should have done more research on it, but I didn't think it was an important enough point to, you know, it was, like I said, it was just something that I joked about, and I said on the message board, and you can go to the message board where I say, if you can think of an example of where it had been used before, let me know and I'll take the claim down. And then of course Dave Aranchek immediately, you know, sent me a file that had like some newspaper things where they did use the term Zodiac killer, and I said okay, but Butterfield then writes this dissertation about how conceited that I am, that I claim to have used the term Zodiac killer, and Butterfield uses a link to the web archive to get me, and basically he's saying, you know what, you can't back away from this because it's already on the web archive. Okay, but what Butterfield didn't realize is that his original version of the crackpot files is also on the web archive, and he can't get rid of that. Okay, so he basically shot himself in the foot when he did that, because I wouldn't have realized that the original version of the crackpot files was there. And then he goes on the Zodiac Expert series, and you ask him about that. You said, you know, Ray Grant says that you edited that, you know, that paragraph out of the crackpot files. And Butterfield comes back and he says, oh yeah, I was just doing that because it didn't flow right, you know.
Yes.
He also, if you read the current crackpot files, he mentions Gareth Penn in about whenever it is, the third or fourth sentence. He just says Penn. He doesn't mention Gareth's full name, and he doesn't tell you who Gareth is. So if he were doing editing on the article, wouldn't he at least do that? If you're writing an article for a peer-reviewed magazine or even for a newspaper, you would give the person's full name before you do anything else. And usually you would have a little bit, Ned Dehan, who puts up videos online about the Zodiac killer, some sort of identifying phrase in there. Butterfield doesn't do anything like that. So you have to assume one of two things. Either he's lying or he's a really lousy editor. But as I said, the fact is, depending on when you happen to talk to him, Michael O'Hare either has no idea who I am, or he's saying things like in the Crackpot Files, Ray Grant uses the same kind of mathematical distortions that Gareth Penn used. And well, how could he know that if he hadn't read my book? Yeah.
Well, I certainly don't believe him that Michael O'Hare has never heard of you. I think he was just saying that because he didn't want to talk to me. He didn't want to answer Zodiac questions that he'd been dealing with for, goodness, that had been 33 years at the time, maybe 34. And I think he was just trying to tell me to move on. He sent me a copy of his Washington Monthly article called Confessions of a Non-Serial Killer.
Which does not mention me.
Well, no, that's why I contacted him, because I knew about that article, and I said, I'm doing this book discussion on Ray Grant's Zodiac Killer Solved. And then he sends me the article, and I'm like, okay, that's all about Gareth Penn. I really want your comment on Ray Grant's Zodiac Killer Solved. If this guy has anything that's wrong, please just give your side of the story. And he just says, I know nothing about Grant.
If you were writing a Washington Monthly article about all the weird things that had happened to you, because you've been accused of being the Zodiac killer, would you not mention the fact that you were a lecturer in public policy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and this guy, Ray Grant, sent a copy of his book, Zodiac Murders Solved, which accuses you of being the Zodiac killer, to every member of the faculty? And when I say I sent copies to every member of the faculty, I decided before I did the mailing that if I sent 90, there were 90 people on the faculty. If I sent 90 copies of my book to the mailroom at Harvard, after 2 or 3 of those packages was opened up, people would start getting warned, and the mailroom clerks would say, "Oh, don't open that up. That's this weirdo, sent the books to everybody on the faculty," and no one would have read my books. So what I did was, before I did the mailing, is I looked up all of the faculty. I looked up their home addresses, and I was able to find home addresses for, I think, 64 out of the 90 faculty members. So those books arrived at their houses, okay? With no fanfare or what have you, they suddenly had this book in the mail, and I had a cover letter that says, "This book accuses Michael O'Hare, who is your colleague, of being the Zodiac killer," okay? And in the next school year, Michael O'Hare was no longer working at Harvard. And this is after Michael O'Hare, in the Harvard class reports, which come out every 5 years, says, I have the greatest job in the world. I'm working in public policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. I have this house where I have this great mortgage. I'm living a fantasy life. And the next thing the following spring, he sells his house. He takes a job he makes a lateral move to a position as a lecturer in public policy at Cal Berkeley's Goldman School. A lot of people will say, well, wait a minute, the Goldman School is ranked number 1. Yeah, the Goldman School is ranked number 1 in 2023. In 1991, it wasn't number 1. It was a fledgling public policy school, and it certainly wasn't anywhere near on the level of the JFK school at Harvard, okay? So wouldn't you expect, if he's writing an article in the Washington Monthly about all the weird things that happened to him, that would be like one of the number 1 things? But he doesn't mention me at all. And the reason he doesn't mention me is, if he mentions me, I can take him to court. I can sue him. forget about him ever suing me. I can sue Michael O'Hare for, mentioning me in an article and putting me in a derogatory light. And the first thing that's going to happen in that civil suit is I'm going to say I want his fingerprints. And what exactly would happen with that? My guess is that because it was a suit brought in a court of law, that the FBI lab would pretty much have to compare the prints that were left in Presidio Heights with Michael O'Hare's prints. If they were found in, according to Robert Graysmith, the two fingers that were left in Presidio Heights represent like 8 points. It's like 8 points on two fingers, and that's a fairly minimal amount of fingerprint evidence. I think 12 points is probably more like it, like what you want. 4 points is like really is virtually not an identification. But 8 points, according to Graysmith, 8 points on two fingers would be subject to the expert's interpretation. However, I wouldn't need it to be an identification. All I would need to do is demonstrate that Michael O'Hare's prints are mutually inclusive with the Zodiac Killer's prints. Okay, I think that would go a long way towards backing me up, or at least toward people taking what I'm saying seriously. There was an article on the original archived message board of Tom Voigt's, which is kind of hard to get to now. Maybe Tom can set up a link. It is online somewhere, but there's an article on that original archive board that is called O'Hare email address. Okay. And if you click on that article, remember, these are people who never heard about Ray Grant. Okay. This was posted on Tom's board like 1999, 2000, 2001. If you read Time 17, he mentions like people that there's this guy named Alan Cabal, capital Cabal, was a guy that Gareth was supposed to meet, I think, in the San Francisco Hall of Justice or something like that. And he was posting on that board at the time. And Alan Cabal says in that message board thread, my original opinion of the two of them, of Michael O'Hare and Gareth Penn, was that Michael O'Hare was committing the murders and Gareth Penn was writing about them. Again, this is from like circa 1999, 2000. If you can find that, it is online somewhere. If you can find that message board thread, basically what it is about the weird behavior of Michael O'Hare and Gareth Penn, and how they seem to know one another, and they seem to be playing this kind of like game with one another. But what the exact nature of their relationship is, no one is exactly sure. But again, this is something that happened long before I had any kind of a profile online. So.
Okay, though, but I do have a question for you about all this, because do you think that it was an ethical choice to mail 96 copies of a book naming Michael O'Hare as a serial killer if he had never been charged with these crimes or named as a suspect by law enforcement?
Yeah, in fact, I've said the same thing. I have defended Mike Morford, although I don't agree with Morph. I've defended Mike Morford, I believe, I'm sure you've read the MacGruber thread on Tom Voigt's. You haven't?
Yes, I have.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah,
I
mean, basically, part of what the critics of Mike Morford are saying is that, hey, you can't say that this McDuff was a serial killer. Look what you're doing to his family. Well, you can't hurt first of all, you can't hurt somebody who's already dead. You can't libel a dead person. Okay.
Sure.
So if Morph honestly believes that McDuff was the Zodiac killer, I would argue that he actually I don't agree with him, but I would argue that he has an obligation to make that information public, and then let the chips fall where they may. If people come forward and say, well, you're crazy, frankly, I think Morph's logic in that actually makes sense. He was checking the people who lived in the vicinity of where the original phone call was made to Nancy Slover. And he said, look, the phone call, the killer had a chance to make the phone call from all kinds of like different locations, from where the murder took place out in Blue Rock Springs Park. He happened to make the phone call from Springs and Tuolumne. Why? Probably because he lived like nearby. He didn't want to call them from his own phone. So he goes out to a public phone, near his house and makes the phone call. To me, that makes perfect sense. That's like people, talking about Mike Rodelli. Mike Rodelli based his identification of Shel Cavalier on the fact that the Zodiac Killer likes writing to the newspapers. Let's go back and look at some of the letters to the editors that were written before the Zodiac Killer period and see if there's somebody there whose letters sound like the letters that are written. Obviously they're not saying this is the Zodiac Killer speak. This is the Zodiac speaking, but letters that had about the same tone as the Zodiac letters. To me, that makes perfect sense. I think Mike's wrong, but that was a good idea, and so was Morse's idea. And it's if his widow is upset by the fact that he's saying that McDuff was the Zodiac Killer, I'm sorry about that, but I don't think he's intentionally doing anything to harm her. It's in a lot of cases. Look at the Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. His family had no conception that he was the BTK killer. His daughter has written a book about the fact. And remember, her DNA was involved in catching her dad because she had a pap smear taken, I think at Kansas State, I think it wherever she went to college. And they got a court order to do a DNA analysis of her pap smear. And it said that, okay, whoever this is a very close relative to his daughter, and Dennis Rader also drove a black Jeep Cherokee that they said was seen in a parking lot video of somebody who had left like a BTK communication. Okay, so that's how they caught his dad. His family was completely blindsided by that. Peter Sutcliffe in England, his family was they had no conception whatsoever that he was the Yorkshire Ripper. Okay. Ted Bundy, I will recommend a book for you. Sure. It's called, it's a book about Ted Bundy by Liz Kendall. It's called The Phantom Prince. And I read that book. It's about Liz Kendall being Ted Bundy's girlfriend. She was Ted Bundy's girlfriend from 1969 until when he was convicted in 1976. And they still went on like phoning each other. Bundy professed to love her. You read that book and you're under the impression that this guy was completely normal. And in fact, I'm going to be honest, Ted Bundy was a better boyfriend than I ever was. I mean, he said, Liz Kendall said, Ted Bundy never hit. I think Ted Bundy slapped her one time because she was hysterical or something, and he had to slap her to slap her just to get her out of it. But other than that, he never did anything physically to harm her, never threatened her. I think one time she was aware of the fact that he had stolen something, and he said, well, if you tell people I stole that, I'm going to break your neck or something like that. But, couple people in relationships say that. But I mean, it's the sort of thing as some people in relationship might say to one another. But there was virtually nothing negative about Bundy in that relationship. It sounds like a very positive relationship. So this idea that people have that somehow a serial killer is going to show himself. Bill Cosby was a serial rapist. I believe the 60 women who have come forward and all saying the same thing, that he raped them, but he also did all these great things. And he was also, I just saw a YouTube video about how I think it was Norm Macdonald pointed out. He said, Bill Cosby found out who my dad was, and he knew that his dad was like a big fan of Bill Cosby. So he went and he got like tickets to one of Bill Cosby's concerts. And Bill Cosby went to the trouble of contacting his dad and making sure that he was able to go to the concert. Although I think by that time his dad was actually dead. But then Norm Macdonald said, yeah, but then Bill Cosby called me up and he says, I'm having trouble getting in touch with your dad. I mean, this whole idea that just because you're a serial killer or you're a serial rapist, and on the one hand, you're doing these terrible things, you can be doing very positive things at the same time. And people don't
Wait a
seem to be
second,
aware
though.
of it.
Wait a
What?
second, though, because a lot of what you said about Macduff is completely reasonable. I also defended Mike Morford for bringing Macduff forward because he genuinely thought that Macduff was the Zodiac. But the difference is that Macduff was already dead, and Michael O'Hare was still alive. And by sending the books to his co-workers, did you get him fired or force him to leave by some means? I know we've talked about this in the comment
Right.
section on YouTube, but like, do you see the difference there?
Oh no, there's the one major difference. I am the only one other than Mike Rodelli. The only two people that I'm aware of who have accused a living person of being the Zodiac killer, where the person making the accusation was putting himself at risk to be sued, are myself and Mike Rodelli. No, Tom Voigt mentioned to me, well, what about Arthur Lee Allen? Arthur Lee Allen was investigated by the police. Arthur Lee Allen is mentioned in Graysmith's original book, but not by name.
Right.
Graysmith calls him Starr, Starr, in the book. Okay, so Graysmith does not put himself at risk to be sued. The only two people that I know of are myself and Mike Rodelli. And the moment Mike Rodelli identified Shel Cavalier on his website, Cavalier took steps to have Rodelli's website taken down. Michael O'Hare has never, or Gareth Penn, have never done anything in an attempt to take me down, because doing that would put them at risk. Is it like a terrible thing to do? If you believe that the guy is the Zodiac killer, I think it is your obligation to step forward and say, hey, to confront that person. And here's the thing: if somebody accuses me of being the Zodiac killer, what's the if let's ask a third party here. Let's ask what Ned Dehan thinks. Ned, suppose I came out with a book and said Ned Dehan is the Zodiac killer. What's your first move?
Well, it happened a couple decades before I was born, so I don't know.
Okay, well, let's assume
Hypothetical.
yeah, but let's assume you were old enough to let's assume all of the requirements to be the Zodiac are fulfilled. You're whatever, it's your dad, or you're 30 years older than you actually are, or well, you'd have to be older, more like 40 years older. Okay, but let's assume all the requirements are made. What's your first move? But let me tell you what I would do. The first thing I would do is I would say, I'm not the Zodiac killer. Here are my fingerprints. Take them, okay? And you will find that they don't match what was left at Presidio Heights. If you want me to hook me up with a polygraph machine, I will be more than happy to do that. I have literally never been in the state of California. Okay, so that would exclude me right there. I've never been. I don't think I've ever been west of the city of Dallas, Texas. So it would be a very difficult thing. Plus, I might very well sue the person. So, but Michael O'Hare hasn't done any of that stuff. What I'm assuming happened at Harvard was And again, 90 of the books were sent to the faculty. 6 of the books were sent to, for example, the Harvard provost, the president of the school, and other administrators at the school. I'm assuming what Harvard did, and this, again, this is just an assumption because reporters have asked me this question. I said, well, Harvard never actually contacted me. But I'm assuming what they did was they went to Michael O'Hare and said, you know, we need you to take some sort of action against this person. We need you to like sue him or make some sort of public declaration that you aren't the Zodiac killer. Now, he does that in the Washington Monthly article, but it's not attached to anything. He's not saying Ray Grant is wrong. I'm not the Zodiac killer. He just says that he isn't the Zodiac killer. But apparently, whatever Harvard asked of Michael O'Hare, he didn't satisfy, because the following spring he sold his house in Brookline. He bought a house in Berkeley Heights, and then you can actually tell there was a very sudden move, because he buys a house in Berkeley Heights in 91, and then he buys a different house in 1995. It's almost as if he bought a house and said, okay, I'm going to live so that I can teach at Berkeley. I'm going to live in this house for a while, and then I'm going to, house hunt and find a place that I really like, and that's what I'm going to do. So that's what he did. He sold the Berkeley Heights house in 91 and bought a different house. I think the name of the street is like Bennett Street or something like that in the main part of Berkeley. So I'm assuming that's what happened, but yeah, I mean, the point being that if somebody accuses you of a crime, you have recourse. You can sue the person, you can take the person to, and remember, the what you don't have the need to prove something without a reasonable doubt in civil court. It just has to be the preponderance of evidence. It just has to be like 51 to 49% basically in civil court. So, I mean, he could have sued me. He could have taken all sorts of actions. In the Washington Monthly article, he says that he's never felt the need to do that, which is all well and good. Okay. But he had the option of doing it, and I honestly don't understand the logic of not coming forward and telling people what your suspicions are. We've seen, for example, in the case of Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski was only caught because his sister-in-law, his brother's wife, said about the manifesto that I believe was published in the New York Times, this sounds like Ted. And his brother then said, well, yeah, maybe you're right here. Well, I'll go to the FBI and see what they think. Ted Kaczynski's brother went to the FBI. The FBI's Unabomber task force was opposed to the idea of serving Ted Kaczynski with any sort of search warrant at the cabin that he lived in the woods. There were 2 members of the task force that went ahead with it. And when they did, there was a memo. I think you can go online and find the memo that was written by all of the other members of the FBI task force that basically disowned the search warrant. And they did that on the basis of the fact they said, well, Ted Kaczynski went to Harvard. He was a math professor at Cal Berkeley. He got his whenever he got his doctorate at the University of Michigan. He's not the Unabomber, okay? But 2 members of the task force essentially said, we think he's weird enough because the manifesto is about the effects of technology on the natural environment and so forth, and he lives in a cabin in the woods. We think this is worth going forward on, and they turned out to be right. Okay, but realize one thing: if Ted Kaczynski was still a teacher at Cal Berkeley, if he hadn't quit his teaching position whenever I think in 1969, if he was still on the faculty, he would never have been investigated, period. And we wouldn't know who the bomber was, and we wouldn't know who Ted Kaczynski was. Now, maybe between 1996 and now, something else would have broken. Okay. I'm just saying the investigation that resulted in his being incarcerated would never have happened. So, yeah, I think the idea that people should not be accused, I think is I don't understand it, because the accused has recourse. The accused can come back and sue you, and that if somebody accused me, that's what I would do.
Say,
I'll give you an example. Ned, I will give you an example.
please.
I was accused of being a poster on Mike Butterfield's board back in late 2011 or early 2012. Compared me to a pedophile, to a serial killer who was a pedophile. I forget but the poster called herself Zabagliona. And people who have been around the Zodiac forums for a while remember her, because she posted on Butterfield's board, and she posted on Mike Morford's private board. But she compared me to a pedophile on Butterfield's board, and it was a public board. And I emailed Butterfield, and I said, "You better take that down, or I'm going to complain to your server." And Butterfield refused to do that. I made a formal complaint to Savvis, Savvis, which was Mike Butterfield's domestic server, and they took his website down. Okay. And Butterfield then had to go to, Tom Voigt remembers this. I think the original website, the original place Butterfield went to was like in Yugoslavia or someplace. And then he ended up in Panama. But the reason that there's no forum on Mike Butterfield's website is that when he had to relocate his server to Panama, it slowed the connection time down to the point where, if people have to wait like 2 or 3 seconds to make a connection, they'll just stop going to that website. And that's basically what happened to Butterfield. Butterfield eventually reached the point where he was the only one posting on his forum. So he shut it down. Okay. But that's just like one example of something that you can do to defend yourself. And it's not that difficult to do.
Well, certainly. And to answer your question, what would I do if I were age appropriate and someone accused me of being the Zodiac killer? Number one, I would deny it. And number two, I would just immediately prepare a 5-minute explanation as to why I was not the killer, and all of the reasons. And now the suspect you've been talking about, Michael O'Hare, he did that in the Washington Monthly